Okay, well, welcome. We're so excited to join you to talk about the early admissions results at selective colleges. A couple of housekeeping notes. We will be sharing the recording of this webinar tomorrow, as well as the presentation itself. There is a Q&A box here in Zoom. I think we probably have all lived in Zoom so long that we're familiar with it, but please feel free to have your questions in there. We'll do our best to answer questions. Sometimes they're so student specific or so situational that we really can't answer them in a quick interaction on a Zoom. We are ESM Prep College Matchpoint, and we are so grateful to spend this time with you. Our founder and senior college coach, Lisa Bain Carlton, is with us this evening. And then Amanda and Nicole, who are also senior college coaches. I'm Bob Carlton. We've been working with kids for 16 years. And so we love the opportunity to talk about what makes kids unique, how they can find colleges where they can thrive, and how to make their journey to college meaningful. Not overwhelming, not stressful, but meaningful. And we know that means that you're going to have to approach this intentionally. So this evening, we want to use the early results from this season and our experience over the last several years to give you advice about how to approach this in a way that can help students thrive in their journey to college. This evening's webinar is the first in a four-part series. That's how deep we want to go to help folks understand what just happened and what does that mean for my student. Okay, so really what we're trying to get at here is the early results. There will be lots and lots of time to unpack the results at the end of this season. 3 weeks from tonight, for those of you that are focused on the University of Texas at Austin, which is not only popular in the South, but was recently named the 10th most popular school among parents across the United States. If you're interested in the early results from that, we'll be having a webinar in 3 weeks on the specific results for UT Austin. In about a month, our colleague Jed Appleruth will be joining us to do sort of a sense of, okay, what does all this mean for standardized testing? It's one of the trends we're seeing. There are certainly changes. Our first question is around standardized testing, and we'll make sure Jed is prepared to address that. And then in several months in May, we'll really crack open the early analysis for the full results from the season. So once all the numbers are in, we'll look at what were our results with students, what do we hear from colleges. Now, we want to give you a context for how we approached this. We were so lucky to work with students either one-on-one as clients, as pro bono students, or students that used our free resources or attended our webinars. So we have a great vantage point into what happened with the early results for the class of 2025. And the students we worked with were just overjoyed with the early wave of decisions. These students got into over 100 different schools, and some of the more selective schools and or students who applied to selective majors at schools, we've listed here. We won't belabor the point and say, well, at Claremont, it was this, but at Purdue, it was this. But please be assured, we really tried to look at the results on almost a student level to understand what are the implications for eighth graders, ninth graders, sophomores, and juniors as they really dig into the college planning process. And then ultimately, as the juniors really shift their focus to the college application process. Amanda, do you want to help give some context for what we're talking about in terms of selectivity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important that we all start with a baseline understanding of what it means for a college or university to be selective. One thing to know about selectivity is that it's not fixed, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But Selectivity is measured by and large by the percentage of students who are successful in achieving admission to a university. And that is not the only way that we assess selectivity, but it is a key way. And it has a large part to do with how selectivity can be a variable year on year and certainly decade on decade. Highly selective schools will always have or generally have admit rates that are less than 25%. And the smaller the percentage, the more selective a school is. And that's kind of a really simple way to think about it. The applicant pool at schools that are selective tends to consist of a significant proportion of students who are highly prepared to be successful in college or university. And that's any college or university, not just these selective colleges and universities. They're going to be strong students with great academic backgrounds, excellent resumes. They're going to have taken rigorous courses, and we're going to look at the elements that make up an applicant pool at a selective school, particularly the successful ones. Um, Selectivity is also variable based on location. So there are schools for which admission might be slightly less daunting if you are an in-state applicant versus if you are an out-of-state applicant. Schools like University of Virginia, UNC, UT Austin, for out-of-state students are often as, or sometimes more, depending on major, competitive as getting into schools that are, really well known for being highly selective. Um, and majors at certain schools, even when the published data is showing you that a school might be borderline in terms of its selectivity, there are certainly majors at many, many schools that are significantly more selective. And we've seen that increasingly with business, computer science, nursing, and engineering across the board, where the challenge of getting into those programs at schools that maybe are even in terms of published admissions rates, not considered selective. So maybe they have 30 or 35% or more admit rates. Students are seeing significantly lower rates of acceptance in those majors. So selectivity, like I said, is not fixed, but something that we're constantly revisiting. And I think this is really important for all of us, maybe, people in my generation who have students who are currently in the process of looking at or considering what their higher education goals are going to be. This is just looking 10 years back. Sometimes we have a slide that looks a little further back, and it's even more startling. But what this is showing you is that what we assume to be true in terms of selectivity has not remained static. And so students who are applying to college in 2014, and as you can see in this slide, we're just highlighting a few, but this is a trend that could be, multi slides long. Students in 2014 were being accepted at the schools on the right at the same rate students in 2024 were being accepted from the schools on the left. And this is really important because as parents, we need, and professionals, and maybe there's some students out there as well, you need to have realistic expectations of what the current model of selectivity looks like. And what it looks like is that it's much broader, it's much deeper, and it's coming from places that might be unexpected based on your assumptions. In 2019, there were 62 institutions that we would consider selective. And in 2024, there are 75. So again, selectivity is not fixed. And just because a school was, comparatively easy to get into in my generation, that has absolutely zero to do with a student's expectation of admissibility in this generation.
This is one thing we notice, particularly with parents. They oftentimes will start their work with a college coach by saying, wow, things are just not at all like they were when I applied to college.
Hmm.
And we oftentimes say, look, we're going to let you off the hook. They're not like they were 5 or 10 years ago. So a school that in your mind might be a safety or even a possible, the admissions rates based on the volume of application growth that schools have seen has really reset some of these benchmarks of selectivity.
That's right.
Lisa, could you take us through at a high level what we're seeing as sort of the four key takeaways from the early decisions that we've seen?
Absolutely. And we're so glad all of you are here with us. Thank you for joining us. So really, we've got four main takeaways. Obviously, there could be a lot more. The first one is application inflation, and this just is about the number of colleges that students are applying to and the just vast amount of applications that colleges are receiving. And so we hear admissions reps just being almost overwhelmed by how many applications that they're receiving. We also sometimes see them, colleges not being able to give decisions when they said they were gonna because of that. So this is something that really started at the COVID era and has just continued. And I think probably the four of us have thought it would chill out, but it hasn't. So this continues, and this is one of the key factors that make selectivity more complicated right now. We also, at the same time, within that pool, we see the rise of selective majors, and this has really taken off. So, when you think about a business major, say 7 years ago versus now, it's so much more selective. So when you're looking at a school, you can't just look at that overall rate. You've got to break it down and try to figure out how selective is business, because there's majors within schools that maybe have a 40% acceptance rate, but a 3% for computer science or something, right? So really, we have to drill down. So a lot of these things are not obvious. So for parents, I really do, I feel this way as a professional, and I'm sure many of you that aren't in this business, it's sometimes just startling to see how much some of this has shifted. And so, we understand that that's difficult to kind of digest the depth that this has taken on. We see a big shift towards early applications. Now, that's both early action, those where you're applying but you're not committing, and in early decision. Both of those pools we're seeing increase. And especially, we're located in Austin, Texas. So in the South, we're especially seeing early deadlines. So, we've seen some schools, adding earlier early action deadlines. So one of the things that this does is it just means that kids have to get started earlier, right? To be ready for, say, the Auburns of the world or the Clemsons of the world or the UVA, like all those schools that are giving us UNC, so we've got a lot of early deadlines in there. So, and that shifts from year to year. So we never know what's going to come up next year. And then I think, yeah, I mean, this is probably as big as application inflation, honestly. Test scores are back for sure. So, really, especially at selective schools, I really think if your student is planning on applying to a selective school, they need to have good test scores. And I think the I think in this year especially, we're just not seeing as many kids getting in test optional, and I saw a pretty high drop with a few kids who tried to go test optional to very selective schools. So although a few schools are still saying they're test optional in the selective range, I think you need to be, and of course it varies. There are some schools in there that are genuinely still test optional, but overall, tests are back. The students need to be, students going for selective schools need to be test prepping and making sure that they're getting the best score they possibly can, because that is going to impact the decisions that they receive. Of course, that's going to be at different levels, like everything at each school. But that's what we hope to cover with you guys from our key takeaways tonight.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. So we know that you're really eager to sort of click down a level. And so over the next couple of slides, Nicole is going to unpack this and talk a little bit about either what we saw from last season or what we're already seeing from this season. Nicole.
Good evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about application inflation and early trends. So these next few slides are unpacking those 2 points that Lisa was talking about. You can see from the graphic here on this slide, applications are rising at an incredible rate. I mean, those of us in the business are still a little bit like, what? But to give you a specific data point, they're rising about 7% year over year. So we're seeing this incredible growth year on year. And in fact, one of the most common questions I get in sort of casual conversation is like, why is college so hard to get into now? People are just kind of like, what's happening? One recent statistic from Common App tells us that the percentage of students applying to more than 10 colleges has doubled in the last 5 years. So that's one reason. There are others as well, but a lot of these things are just changing in really exponential ways. And so we're seeing the colleges, the applications, the field respond to these changes. Another trend we're seeing is that early action applications are increasing. So this year at a rate of 17%, which is driven largely by public universities. So we're seeing that kind of happening in that sector. There is growth just in so many areas in terms of applications going up and up and up. You see it geographically. So this year in the Southwest region, specifically Texas, you saw a 35% increase in applications. Also seeing increases in that region and in smaller states. So places like West Virginia and DC seeing 26 and 24% increases. We're seeing demographic growth. So Latinx applicants up 14%, Black African American applicants up 12%, first generation, first in their family to college applicants up 15%. And then in a really interesting change, we've seen domestic applicant growth exceeding international growth, which is the first time that's happened since 2019. And so really before the pandemic, since the pandemic, we've seen that international growth just skyrocket, partly due to the test optional trends. But now we're seeing that domestic applicants are even outpacing that. So everything is just growing. We're seeing enormous growth in applications to large flagship state institutions. So these really popular places like the University of Texas. And then one knock-on effect of that is that then the out-of-state applications become so much harder to get into, also in-state as well, but it really drives those out-of-state admit rates down. So, I mean, the general takeaway is just that applications continue to go up. Is kind of the takeaway from this trend. Application inflation is real. I want to take a moment and make sure we're clear about the terms we're using. So I'm going to explain each of these admissions terms so that everyone understands the terms we're using as we go through the webinar, and you also understand kind of what's behind these. So rolling admission is a simple application at maybe between certain parameters, but basically at any time between those parameters, and you receive a admission decision in return. Could be a week, could be a month, but it's submit an application, get a decision. This rolls along until they close or fill their class. When you look at something like the rest of the terms I'm going to use, the rest of the plans, these are all, they have a deadline, and then they're going to have a decision return all at once. And so with the other plans, they want to take stock of the whole pool, see who's in it, and then return decisions based on the whole pool. So with early action, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're just applying earlier. There are no binding commitments in early action, and it just gives students and colleges a chance to move that application a little bit earlier in the process, kind of spreads out applications for colleges, gives students early answers. There is something called restrictive early action, which is only done by the very selective and fancy institutions, such as places like Yale and Stanford. This is going to be an early action plan, so an earlier deadline without a binding commitment, but it has restrictions on how many early action schools you can apply to. So it's intended to convey a first choice school without the binding commitment of early decision. Very few schools offer it, but it can confuse things when you start hearing about all these different early things. You're like, I'm really confused. When you look at early decision, we sort of shift paradigms here, because early decision will require a binding commitment from a student and a family. So if you apply early decision to an institution, you would apply sometime around November 1, November 15. They would return you an answer, and if they admit you, you are required to attend and withdraw your other applications. And so this is a considered decision that families should make thoughtfully with a first choice school. Early decision 2 is the same concept later. So you can do an ED1 early decision or ED1 school, get denied or deferred, and then also do an ED2 school. So you can actually make 2 binding applications in a cycle. But they're the same principle that if you're admitted, you are ethically committed to enroll, and then you withdraw your other applications. So a little bit of one and done type of a scenario. The last bit is regular decision, which is sort of like OG admissions. It's like original Coca-Cola. So hello, this is sort of like what admissions was when we all applied to college. You applied by the deadline. They told you by April. There's no binding commitments. There's no restrictions. There's no funny terminology. It's just applying to college and getting an answer. So all of these sort of wrap up by late spring. And that's when you see colleges evaluating their pool and seeing who's coming. So you'll hear words like yield and making their class. And then at the end of regular decision and ED2 and all the rolling processes and stuff, that's where you're going to see waitlist activity and other things kind of coming into play there. So as we break down these application types, this slide is specifically showing a couple of early decision institutions. So these statistics are, these numbers graphs here have the ED1 data from this cycle. The schools here are highly selective private universities. And again, the message is the same. Everything's trending up, right? I mean, so you see some dips and bits here and there, but the graphs are all going up. As we move to the next slide, in the case of early decision, which you saw on the last slide, some real-time stats on the last slide, but one of the reasons we're seeing this increase in applications is because of the advantage that's conferred to students who apply through an early decision plan. In the case of Brown and Rice and Duke and the schools you see here, you're looking at a significant advantage. In some cases, as much as ×4 if you're an early decision applicant. This advantage does come at the cost of an early commitment. And so for students looking at these numbers, the trade-off is you have a better chance of getting in, but you are sacrificing your ability to choose once you get in. So you can't evaluate your options, whatever. And the reason the numbers look like this is because many of the schools are taking a large percentage of their class through early decision. And so if they've taken half of their class through early decision plans, what happens is a much larger part of the applicant pool comes in regular decision, and they then only have half the spots. And so what we're seeing kind of under the hood is that many schools are taking larger and larger percentages of their class through early decision, which is what's making these numbers look like this, and which is also driving down their overall admit rate because the yield is, anyway, I won't get too far down the rabbit hole here. So the last slide is going to highlight schools using early action policies. And so that's back to those kind of non-binding policies, right? And we're seeing a lot of schools deferring rather than admitting early. And just to break down what we're seeing here, Yale is one of those restrictive early action policies. USC and Georgetown are offering a more standard early action policy without restrictions. Interestingly, in the case of Georgetown, they as policy, they don't deny anyone, so they're deferring everyone into the regular pool, but you will still notice that the admit rate is very, very low. And so in the case of all of these institutions, you're seeing very low admit rates through an early action program. Why are they deferring? Because they have a lot of applications and it's very difficult to get through all of the reading early. So some of them just actually can't do it. And so they have to defer into the next round. They want the students who they admit to come, right? This is called yield. When they invite you, they want you to say yes. And so they might be worried that these other students are in early decision pools and they wouldn't come. And so they might be kind of hedging to see what happens. And then they might also be watching for grades. So those kind of first semester, senior year grades could be a huge part of an admit or deny decision, depending on the student. I think as you look at early action rates, it's important to know that deferring isn't denying. As standard policy, these schools are not taking enormous amounts of students through early action. And so there's still a pretty wide range of what can happen in the regular decision pool. Also remembering that schools are taking in their entire application pool through regular decision and evaluating it. So I've been doing this for 25 years now, and I've lived through cycles where the regular decision pool was not as expected. And so we needed to go lower into than what we did in early, and where the regular decision pool was way up. And so kids that we thought were going to get in early had no chance once the whole pool was in. So you actually don't always know. So, we can try to predict, but those of us who've been in the field a long time have basically learned to stop predicting anything because everything is just changing all the time now. But there are ways that you can increase, like sort of help your deferral become an admit. Submitting letters of continued interest, letting them know that you really want to come, demonstrating your interest through visits and interviews, and sort of not getting discouraged, like knowing that some deferrals are to be expected, and just kind of keeping those grades up, keep doing the thing, keeping your options open, and kind of waiting to see how it all goes, because there's always a fun surprise somewhere in a college admission cycle, and you never know if it's going to be the thing that sets you off on a neat path. So I think that's me for now. Bob, back to you.
Yeah. So the rise of highly selective majors. Lisa mentioned this. I would say for many parents, this is frankly one of the most surprising parts of college admissions in the sort of new normal. At many schools, what is your major is one of the most important decisions that an applicant will answer. At many schools, it's not a question at all, but increasingly we're seeing selective, both public universities and even some selective private colleges really say, please explain to us what you think your major would be. And your odds of getting in differ greatly by major, as Lisa mentioned. Now, generally on webinars, we immediately see in the Q&A box, what is the admit rate for business at University of Virginia? And the answer is, we wish we knew, and we wish University of Virginia would release admit rates by major, like the University of California system did in November of last year. So for the first time ever, the University of California system said, we're going to be fully transparent by college, by institution. So what you see here is the vast difference between nursing, God bless them, 1% of the UCLA nursing majors versus the public administration major and the life sciences major, which are roughly speaking less competitive than the overall admit rate for UCLA. So you need to think of this as a spectrum that averages out to the average admit rate for that school. But some majors, like computer science at most schools, are at the more competitive end of highly selective majors. And then while it's not always the case, it is oftentimes the case that a major in the humanities or in the social sciences may be substantially less competitive than an engineering, than a computer science, or than a business major. In addition to UCLA, there are some other public universities or competitive universities where we've seen demonstrable differences among majors. Computer science, particularly the more competitive programs at an MIT, at a Carnegie Mellon, at a WashU, at a University of Washington, are exceptionally competitive. And this goes back to what Amanda was saying, that the overall admit rate at University of Washington is certainly not 3%. But the computer science admit rate is really, really tight. At large publics, business majors are oftentimes super competitive. And then engineering programs, and I think the two schools that have seen the greatest explosion in applications for engineering majors have been Cal and Georgia Tech. And frankly, one of the more difficult needles to thread is being an out-of-state applicant to Georgia Tech as an engineering major. It can be oftentimes as challenging as applying to an Ivy League university.
And can I add one thing here, Bob, just before we
Sure,
go?
please
Is
do.
that it could be tempting to think, okay, great. All of you are just going to become humanities majors. Okay. Then we often get that question. So, what if I just whatever? Remember that your entire story that you're telling, so the activities, the classes you've taken, the direction you've taken, your test scores, all those things will need to line up with that major. So, and at the end of the day, you have to think about what is the major that the student genuinely wants to pursue. So while it can be tempting to think, oh, I want to game the system, be careful there because it oftentimes isn't serving the student well. So I just wanted to throw that in because that is such a frequent question.
I want to piggyback on your piggyback and mention two other things. Most colleges and universities will say your best shot of getting a highly selective major is as an incoming freshman applicant. Please do not come here and think you will be able to transfer into a highly selective major. And then some students, sort of in Lisa's frame of sort of trying to look at it, quote unquote, strategically, will say, hey, I'm going to apply to be, as an example, an economics major. But then I'm going to switch over to business. And our answer is typically, do you want to study economics for 4 years? Because if you get into Michigan or UT or Cal as economics, you shouldn't expect you will be able to transfer to business. And that can be very, very challenging. We oftentimes phrase it, are you UT or bust, or are you business or bust? What is the prioritization there? Thanks for flagging that, Lisa. Amanda, do you want to unpack this sort of test optional, test ignorant trend? And I want to say that while Amanda and our team are all great at testing, this is sort of your appetizer for 5 weeks from now when Jed Appleruth will open up a fire hose and go deep into the testing trends. But Amanda, do you want to give a quick context on what we're seeing on testing?
Yeah, and so I want to first point out that this is a webinar about selective admission. So when we're talking about testing right now, I need to acknowledge that the vast majority of schools in the country will remain test optional, and they have been test optional for a really long time. That said, most highly selective schools and selective schools have possibly toyed with and introduced some test optional and test flexible policies, particularly throughout COVID. But what we know is that a lot of those schools are going back, and we sense that trend kind of snowballing as we approach this next class. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about test optional and test free policies broadly, and then I'll look a little bit at what we encourage students to think about in terms of their testing as they approach the application process. Test optional really means that students can be nuanced in their approach to submitting tests to different schools. When they have testing that could be supportive at a few schools and not supportive at a few schools, they can choose how to use those tests. Test free and test blind, like the UC system, University of Washington at the moment, these are schools that are not considering tests at all. So it doesn't matter how great your tests are and how hard you studied for it, it's not going to have any impact on your admissibility at that school. Test required means exactly what it says. They want to see that testing. It doesn't matter if you want them to see it or not. They need to see it. And if you want to apply there, you need to have it. And test flexible means that they acknowledge there are lots of different tests out there in the world, and there are different ways to demonstrate that you have the capacity to be successful at their school. All schools have a test policy of some sort, and they are, like, maybe the whole theme of my slides tonight is that it's variable, but it's variable. It's going to keep changing. It is continuously changed, and I think one of the things that you benefit from working with professionals is that you don't have to figure it out yourself. You don't have to keep your pulse on every school you might be interested in. That's our job. With selective admissions, it is not uniform to say every selective institution has gone back to requiring testing. However, it is really important to acknowledge that if selective admissions is going to be part of your child's process, your child's journey, having test scores in their pocket is going to be extremely important. Having test scores that are supportive of their overall profile is also extremely important. And what that means is that the testing should resemble in some way the grades that they're producing in the classes that they're choosing to take. So there's a correlation between, strong, satisfactory to strong test scores and strong grades. It is really difficult to know exactly what schools are going to require testing this cycle, next cycle, the cycle after that. But what we do know is that the volume of applications can't just keep expanding without any check. And colleges need another method by which to assess students that is a benchmark. And so testing will continue to come back at selective institutions. And like I said, since selectivity is variable, testing will continue to come back at some rate or another. We just had Penn come back to the testing side just a couple of weeks ago. While it's fairly late in the cycle for schools to announce testing changes, we do anticipate other schools making that announcement over the next few months. So if you have a rising senior and they are thinking they might want to pursue some selective admissions, we strongly encourage you to get them in a testing situation sometime over the next 6 to 8 months so that they have that in their pocket to make some applications. Another thing that we really like to highlight about this, and this is kind of what I alluded to when I said that students with test optional admissions could be nuanced in their approach. Test optional did not mean that schools were ignoring testing, right? If you are a strong candidate who had a strong academic profile and a great resume, and you also demonstrated that you had strong scores, they weren't going to turn a blind eye to that. Strong scores help their overall profile as an institution when they are being assessed by their peers. So they are going to appreciate that additional evidence of strength in their applicant pool. It is going to be something that enhances an application if it exists. At schools that are truly test optional, it won't necessarily be something that detracts from an application if it doesn't exist, but solid testing, I think, is generally going to be supportive. And we've seen that borne out with our students across the academic spectrum.
One thing to piggyback here is that we oftentimes, when we are working with a student and they start by saying, what score should I be shooting for? Just a classic summer before junior year question. As Amanda said, an answer is typically, it depends. And a good rule of thumb is to say, let's look at your most selective schools on your list, the schools that are most likely to be in the reach category, and let's look at a target score of the top quartile of scores that that school admitted students with. Again, nothing is hard and fast here, but it gives students, particularly motivated students, something to shoot for. And that is publicly available for every college and university in the United States. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick overview of when we pulled the lens all the way back. What made the difference for the seniors that we worked with this year who were overjoyed by their early results? And I would actually say the faces on this slide don't even begin to capture what we saw in students' faces when we jumped on Zoom and they told us, I got into a school that I never even dreamed of. And we were able to say to them, wow, you made that happen. We saw a couple of core issues. The first and foremost is depth, deep engagement in the classroom, outside of the classroom, a sense that the student drove that. This isn't a sprint. This isn't that they looked up in March of junior year and said, I'm going to hit the gas. It instead was a student really motivating themselves to dig into topics that engage them in the classroom and to look at how can they take their aptitudes, their skills, their motivations, and really translate that to the communities that they're a part of. Amanda mentioned test optional. I would say for the selective schools, colleges can afford to look for depth and can afford to look for markers that those activities showed initiative. In many cases, these are students who have had a multi-year engagement, either in their field of study, in a topic that fascinates them, in a problem in the world. And then the final thing I would say is, even in the world of AI, and you'll notice that we're not really covering AI on any of these slides, but in a world of AI, authenticity really seemed to break through this year. Authentic essays, authentic applications, and most importantly, students' authentic engagement. An AI bot, as powerful as it is, can't do the hard work of volunteering, the hard work of doing an internship, the hard work of doing research. And they certainly can't come close to the creativity and curiosity of the teenagers that we were lucky enough to work with this year. Nicole, can you shift to the college side of the table and to talk a little bit about how they see this in the applications that they're receiving?
Sure. So I started my career as an admissions officer at Vanderbilt University, which sounds way fancier than it is. But your job is just to read piles and piles of applications, and then travel around and try to go see the students and make sense of the schools they're coming from. So the components you see listed here are the inputs that are coming into an admissions file. And you know, a lot of these folks are young, or you know, it's there's a whole big process going on, and then every school can change what they want, or what they need. So you might see institutional priorities or imperatives beginning to shift, which ones of these inputs they are making, you know, more important in their process. I will say that in most cases, the courses and grades piece is always the most important. And so it's really difficult to overcome something that's lacking and when we talk about courses and grades, we're also talking about what we call rigor, so difficulty of courses. And so in the case where, for example, we've been talking a lot about majors, but if you're applying to a business school and you don't have calculus and it's a selective business school, it's very difficult to overcome that missing piece with any of these other things like activities or rec letters. So that tends to be the backbone of most files, particularly in a selective context. You've heard about testing and how it may or may not factor in an incredibly variable way, as Amanda's correct in saying. But that's the reason that they have standardized data is so they can compare apples to apples. Because if you have courses and grades from colleges, I mean, from high schools all over the United States, if you've ever, I mean, the transcript differences from state to state, from school to school, from public to private, the GPA grading scales, they're all different. And so what happens is you come with this big pile of students doing all different things in all different places, and their GPAs are all different, you know, and their schools doing things differently. They offer different courses. And so then a standardized test, such as an SAT, an AP score, things like that, those are comparing students nationwide. They're nationally standardized. And so it just allows colleges to have that other piece of data that's standardized along with the courses and grades that will be different. And so they're having to make sense of those. Activities are sort of that resume piece, and schools will care more and less about this piece of it. Some of them are going to want targeted activities. Some of them really want well-rounded students. Some of them are looking for pieces like service or philanthropy or compassion or, you know, sort of good citizenship. Some of them are more interested in leadership. But on the whole, colleges are looking for students who are engaged. They want to see students who are engaged in their current communities because they want students who are going to come to their communities and engage with the students, the professors, the people in the town, the classes. And so whether that's through sports or student council or whatever it looks like, you're really looking for students who are engaged and who are experiencing the world, learning new skills outside the classroom. Essays are that very subjective piece, and essays are also variable, and they will probably also change again this year. But it really depends where you're applying, how much you write, what you write about, and it depends on what's going on in the world, because we have seen essays change pretty dramatically over the last couple of cycles. But, it's a chance for a student to kind of like Bob was saying, that authentic voice coming through. This is where you see that. This is what I would call sort of the third dimension. This is what humanizes a student. When you're reading files, it's just numbers and facts. And then when you get to the essay, you feel like you start to know them when it's a good essay, and that's what really brings a student to life. Captures the reader's imagination or lets them have a sense that they know the student. Recommendation letters do some of the same. And so they're more of that kind of qualitative data where you can understand what a student's like in the classroom, what our professors like to have this student. Are they coachable? What's their intellectual, potential? So rec letters and essays really bring in that kind of qualitative piece and the vibe, the humanization, all of that stuff. Interviews are often optional, but are again a chance for students to just put more inputs into the process, right? So anytime you get a chance to help them get to know you better, to give them more information about you, optional essays, interviews, students should always be taking advantage of that. All of these things can help to increase your chances and make you feel really good about the applications you've submitted. Know that you did your best, know that you put your best foot forward, so that as the results come out, you feel great about the path you're walking forward on. The last piece is demonstrated interest, which some schools care about and some schools don't. But this is your communication to the school that you want to go there. So the ultimate demonstration of interest is, of course, an early decision application if the college offers that. This is like, you're my number one, I love you. Yeah, and you don't want to go overboard. We I've seen some very scary letters, sort of stalkery, about how much people must go to Vanderbilt or their lives will be over. So that's not what we're looking for here. What we're looking for is that you've visited the campus, that you've attended their virtual programs, that you met their representative when they came to your school, and you've let them know, like, I've done my research. My application is based on a fit, that I know why I want you. And that also, if you admit me, there's a good chance I'll come because this is a good match. And more schools care about this because they want to make offers to students who want to come, right? And this has become a pretty important part of the process. You will see it less important the larger the school is. So the bigger the numbers, the less important it will be because their scales are just different. And then the smaller the school, I think the greater impact you can make with demonstrated interest. So these are kind of the data pieces that admissions officers are working with when they're deciding who to admit. As I said, they can sort of shift a little in terms of which one is a little bit more emphasized. They can be different, as kind of Bob was talking about, within certain divisions. So if you're applying into an engineering division or something like that, these can be a little different. But this is sort of what you have to work with when you think about, how am I going to create the best possible application? These are the things that the admissions readers will be focused on when they get your file.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Amanda, could you give us a little bit of an overview? We've talked a lot about transcript, but could you maybe take a couple of minutes and talk about grades?
Yes. So again, going with the theme of variability, what we know is that every high school teaches high school in a different way, right? While there are standardized courses and offerings across various curricula, students, and people on this call, your children are possibly doing AP curriculum, honors curriculum, advanced curriculum, IB curriculum, A-level curriculum, who knows, right? The reality is that colleges understand these various curriculum. They understand the context from which students are applying. So there is very little value in you talking to someone whose child goes to a different school and comparing those transcripts. That's my number one piece of advice. That said, it is important for you to understand the context from which your child is applying or your student is applying. And what that means is understanding what the grades are typically like from the school that you're applying from and what the overall rigor levels look like from that school. So at some schools, at some high schools, that might be that students making selective applications are coming in with a handful to maybe a dozen APs. But you might have a child at a different school that offers no APs, that might offer their own self devised advanced classes, but you know these kids are getting into the same schools as kids coming with 10 or 12 APs. So we don't want to compare apples and oranges, two different curriculum styles, and try and assess whether or not a student's rigor is at the right level. At a particular school, you're going to be able to say, is my child taking the most rigorous courses available to them that they can be successful in? Important caveat. And are they doing it in a way that enhances their profile, enhances their curiosity, demonstrate that authenticity that Nicole was just talking about? So everyone's transcript shouldn't look exactly the same. There should be nuance amongst them for students who are maybe going in a health sciences direction. They're going to be maybe taking courses in advanced anatomy instead of taking, environmental science. They might be doing something that is more specific to their area of interest. But they're going to be taking the highest level of rigor that they can within that context. We do know that we want to see strong grades in core classes, and sometimes that's not what students want to hear from us or from you. But what that means is that when you are committing to going down the route of highly selective admissions or selective admissions, we would expect students to be pursuing core classes all the way through the 4 years of high school. And sometimes that means sticking with a language. Sometimes that means taking that next math class, even if you fulfilled graduation requirements. But also then putting the rigor value where it matters to them the most. So if that's in calculus and physics, if you're going in a STEM, engineering, business direction for calc in particular, or if it's in Gov and Euro and language, if you're going towards the humanities or political science or legal studies, or if it's in studio art or art history, if you're going towards architecture. We care most about where the student chooses through their authentic curiosity to apply that rigor that's going to benefit them the most down the road with their applications.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda.
Sure.
Two quick things at a sort of a high level is sort of what has set students apart. And Nicole talked about the inputs beyond the grades. What we would say is a couple of things. One, really understand how important depth is. Two, understand that colleges have their own institutional priorities, and they look for students whose values, whose impact matches that. And in terms of when to approach this by grade, we understand that there are really different life stages, really different developmental priorities for students who are in the 9th grade versus the 11th grade. Our watchword for ninth graders is explore and discover. In 10th grade, we oftentimes see students beginning to focus on highly selective schools or majors, and so they deepen their involvement. And then we certainly see 11th graders all the way through summer before senior year really showing lasting impact and having their activities showing clear initiative. In webinars like this, we always hear from parents, could you tell us some examples to make this real? So Lisa has 2 different case studies that she's going to walk us through to give you a sense of students that we worked with this year, obviously anonymized, and the journeys that they've had to highly selective schools. Lisa.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to start out with my first student, and she started with me in the 10th grade. And she came as a very independent student, not really any direction on major, but just a great student overall, probably the top 3 or 4 student in her class. And she kept that the whole time. And I think that is one of the things to stress. The more selective the school that the student is looking for, the higher grades they're going to need to have because it's so competitive. She had a few things already going on. She was really involved in theater and she was really involved in choir. So those were her, like, kind of the things that she was enjoying when we met her. She also had made this Instagram account really because she had seen bullying going on and she wanted to promote kind of kindness and joy and happiness. So she just made kind of a I don't even know how to describe it. Creative Instagram account that just was funny and happy and positive. And when we met her, she had a fair amount of followers. And so she kept that going throughout. But what became really interesting was to start to take that apart. Why is it you're spending so much time on this? And so what really kind of emerged was that she really was someone who wanted to help people come together, to get along, to be kind. So she joined student government and she started this whole kindness movement at the school that really took off and still going on today. And then she upped the amount that she was doing on her Instagram. And all of this was her. One of the things I want to stress about highly selective students is it's almost always student driven, because at this level that we're looking for students to move and succeed in, it has to come from them. Otherwise, you can read it from a mile away. And so I always say that we can start to tell which students are going to be successful by the ones that are driving the process. And parents, that's not to say you don't have a role, but it is to say that if you're at the front and they're way at the back, that they may not be great candidates for the most selective schools. That doesn't mean there's not lots of great schools. So back to my story, sorry. So then what happened is the student kind of took this and really grew it in the school. So there were multiple programs going on at a subject that I think is important to schools, especially, with so much bullying and cyberbullying and all that going on. Ultimately, she had the chance to do an independent project. And so at that point, she decided, wait, I'm actually academically interested in this. Like, what does make people act kind? What does make people happy? And she did this super fascinating independent research project on kind of the psychology behind all of this. She was a straight humanities student. We knew she wasn't going to be STEM or anything like that. And was, the theater was actually quite a serious interest. And of course, she went on to become the lead in the plays, won a lot of awards for her singing. She also was in one of the culture clubs. She was the president of that. So she had a lot of other things going, but she created organically, and that's what I want to stress. So that she never went to a summer program. She never went to but all of this was self-motivated. And what my role as her consultant was to be a thinking partner and ask questions to help her kind of keep going. Do you know what I'm saying? And she did very well in the process and ended up at Brown and certainly, had other great options. So that's a very kind of student who didn't have the traditional major, was kind of organic, but was able to pull a thread through, and then also was able to reflect on it. And that's why it has to be student driven. Where things fall off the bus in applications is if the activities are very parent led. When we get to that point to try to get the student to reflect on it, they struggle so hard because they don't have their why they did it. And so that's one of the things that's really important in this process, is that the student owned it and they understand their why, because that can be very compelling. So when you go back to those essays, that ability to reflect. Now, my other student, fear not, everyone does not have this kind of student. So I have a totally different student for my second student that went to Rice. So he was a very linear kid. So I met him, I believe, between sophomore and junior year, and he was top of his class in the top 7% at a rigorous high school. He was great at math. He had always been interested in business. And so he came to the table with some really smart things, which was a whole lot of coursework in business already. His school offered that. Now, some schools will offer that, some schools won't. You can include that, though, in your resume to show that fit to major piece. And then from there, his he had the good grades, he had the good test score. He had some other really cool things that he had been doing. He was in the marching band, and he went on to become the lead, I forget what you call it, drum major, I believe is what it's called, of the marching band. So he was had a lot of leadership there. And then he, in the summer between junior and senior year, he took community college classes in accounting, because by then that's what had resonated with him. And he also did a summer internship at an accounting firm. And then he had been tutoring math from the 9th grade forward at the middle school nearby. So he had a very kind of linear, organized, kind of knew what he wanted to do, needed help to just kind of take it to the next level. And so I'd like to highlight two different students. He also had, again, a good ability to reflect on what he was doing. So he was able to express in that application how this had impacted him. For example, the things that he had done in band. He was an accomplished musician as well. So I'd like to give you two kind of different examples, because one of the things is to figure out what's going to resonate with your student. Each student is different. So we don't want a cookie cutter. This is not a menu and you follow it and everybody does the same thing. You're just going to look like everybody else. And you also have to know your student and what's going to work for them. So as you take off on this journey, realizing that there's many different ways to be successful. There's not one way. It does have to have student buy-in and engagement. And sometimes I say to students, like, I might want a certain car, but am I going to work hard enough to get it? I don't know. So like they might like that name college, but are they willing to show up and do the work for it? That might have a different answer, and we need to get it honest. There's not a judgment in that. There's so many great colleges. So I think those are conversations to have at home, and to really look at ways to help your student own things, I think is one of the things that I see as a thread, and I've been doing this a long time, of my students that are really successful.
Thanks, Lisa. I think you can see by Lisa's enthusiasm, we could spend the next 3 hours just gushing and bragging on the incredible students we were able to work with this year and the joy they had in their early admissions results. Again, as a reminder, we'll be sharing the recording of this webinar and this material tomorrow with you. We have 3 upcoming webinars if you want to see an even deeper dive on testing. In 3 weeks, we'll do University of Texas at Austin and give 3 different case studies of what made an impact there. And then much later this spring, we'll go deep into these entire results. We want to end where we started. Students can thrive in this process. We know from surveys that this can sometimes be, unfortunately, the most stressful part of the high school experience for students and parents. And we'll leave you with this challenge. The great opportunity for teenagers is for their journey to college to have meaning and joy. Yes, there's parts of it that are not necessarily particularly joyful, but those should not be the driver. The driver should be, how do they get more involved and how do they propel into college with all the enthusiasm that they've built during high school? Thank y'all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you.